Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. Today I'm joined by Stewart Home, a legend of counterculture. He's an artist, filmmaker, pamphleteer, art historian, and activist. He discusses his book, Fascist Yoga, Grifters, Occultists, White Supremacists, and the New Order in Wellness. Home sweeps away the half-truths of Western yoga to expose a world full of grifters, cult leaders, TV celebrities, and fake gurus. The story of yoga has involved some of the strangest currents of humanity. Here's our discussion from September 8, 2025.
Hi, I'm Stewart Home. I was born in London a very long time ago, in the 1960s, and I've written a few books since then, although not when I was, not in the 1960s or 70s, but starting in the 1980s. And covered various subjects, mainly written novels, but written a few non-fiction books. So first book was about post-war avant-garde anti-art situations and fluxus before those became such a big thing. That was in the 80s. Then some novels, another non-fiction book about punk rock, written in 3 weeks, because although I spent years thinking about the subject, I didn't think I should spend years writing about it, although I do have friends like John Savage who have done that and been very successful with it, not knocking their books, I just have a different approach. Also done a book on Bruceploitation films, which is a subgenre of martial arts which riffs on Bruce Lee, usually described as after his death, but I disagree with that, because if you actually look at some of the early Filipino, for example, films that they used to rip off big cinema hits, there's The Pig Boss from 1972, riffing on The Big Boss. As it was in the UK anyway, but in the US it was Fist of Fury or Fist of Fury, and then the Chinese connection too for what we had as Fist of Fury. But worldwide it was The Big Boss and recognizable as such in the Philippines. And then always enjoyed going to the gym since I got a bit older, when I realized I was getting out of shape because I never bothered before. And tried free yoga classes at the gym, which didn't entirely go well from a perspective of me thinking it was wonderful. So ended up writing this book about yoga, partly because Pluto wanted to talk to me about republishing an old book, and I said, well, why not do a new book instead of an old one? So we did do a new book. They were less interested when I was talking about the history of the City of London as a potential subject for a book and its civic structure. But when I said fascist yoga, their eyes lit up. The editor's eyes, yeah.
So the book has quite a long subtitle. It's called Fascist Yoga, Grifters, Occultists, White Supremacists, and the New Order in Wellness. And this seems incredibly relevant today as we're moving into a political sphere that is now everything that was once kind of sidelined in mainstream culture is now kind of bubbling up into our mainstream public discourse. And yoga is one of those sidelined activities that has quite a dark history. And I would love for you to begin by telling us how you came to discover this dark history, and did it surprise you what you learned?
Well, first of all, I just went to some yoga classes at my gym. I was going to boxing classes and doing weightlifting, as one does. And I decided, because I did different things when I did public readings of my books, so I hated reading from the book, so I would memorize. Then I moved into ventriloquism, which, having a South London accent, I have a natural talent for, because we don't open our mouths much. And it's a kind of drawl, which some people mistake for being Australian, but actually this is a really generic speaking through my nose, but you don't speak through your nose if you're from South London. I wanted to stand on my head, so they didn't do any kind of gymnastic classes in my gym membership, but I had free yoga classes. Well, I'm paying for it, I might as well go and learn to stand on my head. And got a very bad reaction in the first class from the other pupils, because I figured I'll go to the yoga class after my boxing class. So they lined up outside and through the kind of glass windows could see that I was doing boxing. And then I stayed in the space, which led to complaints to the teacher. But obviously, she had to tell them that I was entitled to do yoga if I chose to do so. But that was not off to a good start. And then the teacher who actually grew up in Las Vegas, so had a kind of not a particular London take on things necessarily. I think she had an English father and an American mother. She started talking about chakras and all sorts of other nonsense. And as I went to I tried some her yoga classes to learn to headstand and a few others, and just couldn't believe the kind of anti-vax kind of stuff I was hearing, which was pre-COVID. This was 2009, 2010. But there was a lot of anti-MMR, mumps, measles, and rubella. And obviously, we've seen the consequences of that more recently, with sadly kids dying because there isn't a sufficient level of vaccination. But just the wellness, if you'll excuse the term, bullshit that I was hearing was quite extraordinary. And claims that if you did a particular yoga pose, it would cure this, that, and the other. So I think, I was particularly fascinated with the headstand, which I wanted to use professionally, and I did quite soon. It was claimed that would cure catarrh, cure headaches. I also discovered later when I was researching the book that at the 1966 British Dowsers Conference, a speaker there claimed that it would make you a better dowser, which is this idea that you can put a couple of twigs together and it will lead you to water underground, although the scientific study of it has shown that it's just a random result that would be exactly the same if you did anything, whether you used a pair of sticks or you just randomly decided there was water in a particular place. So there were all these kind of claims, uh, which led me to want to read up on its history a little bit. And then the thing that put the fascist element in was in 2016, I saw a newspaper report which had a picture of a guy sitting in a half lotus pose at the top, with a MAGA hat on his knee and a Celtic cross behind him, flag. And so the report was kind of, this is surprising. This guy, is a yogi and he's into the tarot and spirituality and healing, but he's also a fascist. But then having come across countercultural fascism, particularly in the music world, and I don't mean so much kind of blood and honor and screwdriver and that kind of hardcore bonehead neo-Nazi music, but around scenes like neo-folk, where the people who started that all were behind the bands who started that had a meta political strategy where they wanted to use culture to draw people into kind of fascism, but not being explicitly fascist. So within that scene, you have people, and have always had people who aren't fascists and people who are fascists, but are coy about what their real politics are. And having seen people within that scene who I think could definitely be identified as fascists, into tarot, into spirituality, into X, Y, and Z, it seemed likely that if you had one fascist yogi, there was a subculture of it. So I went and looked and quickly found, through a few internet searches, some examples. So that was what kind of the two things that started me off. And then I, did some blogs about it, forgot about it for a while, had the meeting with Pluto, sort of towards the end of the kind of COVID thing. They were at the London Book Fair and wanted me to go in and speak to them. And when I mentioned fascist yoga, this was what I was set on my path to write the book.
Yeah, and I think you make a pretty good case for why yoga kind of attracts this sort of grift occultism and kind of what we would call in the States woo, where, it's just this catch-all, kind of like chiropractic. Not only do they do the postural poses, then they inscribe on it this whole other, like, as you said, wellness uh, activity, which is usually so far removed from science and um, all that evidence-based healing. So before we get into the various characters you deal with in the book, can you explain to us a little bit why you think yoga is primed for this fascist infusion and why it seems to pull in all these other disparate threads of con man, grifting, and that kind of stuff.
I think because you have to understand to start with, there's a separation between what yoga really described in India, particularly before the 20th century. And obviously, religious beliefs are reinvented. So figures like Vivekananda, who became very famous for going to the World's Religious Fair in the US at the end of the 19th century, kind of reformulated a lot of Hindu beliefs. So it's not that they're timeless, but what happened with what's called yoga in the West is it is essentially Western exercise systems that have had Orientalist fairy dust dropped on them. And, when I started looking at this, there was already an academic discourse around that, but that suggested that this started in the 1920s and 30s with guru figures in India who mixed Western exercise systems, which they said were inferior versions of ancient Indian exercises, although they weren't, with religious practice. We'll turn when we get into the book into why I think possibly this happened earlier and not in India but in the USA. But I think just when you take a physical exercise system and then lay a heavy religious content on it, it becomes deeply problematic. And the kind of people who are attracted to that often have kind of anti-empiricist and very essentialist worldviews, so that they think that whatever they believe is true and is they won't accept kind of empirical evidence or scientific method as a form of argument. I mean, that's not unique to yoga. My own mother was a beatnik, turned into a hippie, and I certainly think in her circles that was the same sort of approach to things, which was why around the time I was born, her and her friends were madly reading things like Morning of the Magicians by Pals Berger, where you see the origins of a lot of those kind of occult Nazi theories, which are again overdone. So it's not unique to the yoga culture, but also if you take that beatnik into hippie kind of thing. And my mother was originally a beatnik, not a hippie. There is a difference if you want to get into that subcultural thing, but she kind of drifted into hippie culture. But that 60s counterculture, again, became very much associated with yoga. And it's in some ways where the story becomes less interesting to me of yoga because you start having more Indian figures imported kind of going through the 60s and 70s. And my mother was a follower of Guru Maharaji, Divine Light Mission, for the last 7 years of her life, 72 to 79. Before that, she'd been into Subud, which is slightly different and not Indian, but she very much became an India freak. So that association with yoga also kind of attracts people with that worldview because it's got that kind of hippy dippy element to it. Yeah, and also just the history when we start talking about the earlier figures. And what interested me was that growing up, I'd been exposed to yoga through Richard Hittleman, a white American on British TV because he had maybe not British, maybe it was only London because I got the London commercial TV stations as a kid, which was what he was on. But certainly in London, you could watch him. He had his own program produced. I don't remember if it was Thames TV or London Weekend, which were they changed over at the weekend. But that's so I didn't necessarily make that association of yoga with India because to me it was this kind of American salesman who had a couple of dancers in leotards demonstrate what he said were yoga poses. And when you go back through that history, the people who spread yoga in the West earlier on, again, tend to be Caucasian and Western. And it's only through the 60s with the Beatles and other kind of countercultural figures, although whether you can call the Beatles counterculture, rather too popular perhaps. But yeah, that kind of scene changes the way people see yoga. Although interestingly, I was talking to a Tai Chi teacher the other day, and she was saying that when she started teaching Tai Chi, which I would guess was either very late 80s or into the 90s, she experienced a lot of people complaining that they only wanted a Chinese Tai Chi teacher. She's white New Zealander. Um, But she was saying it's funny because that never happened with yoga, that you always had all these white yoga teachers. And I think when you go back, there's this forgotten history of essentially white yoga teachers spreading yoga through the media and through books. So that's, yeah, one of the reasons why yoga's maybe a little bit different in terms of things. I mean, not that there isn't a lot of woo in Tai Chi, but I do. And there's also exaggeration of its age. It's maybe 200 years old in different, different family styles date from different periods, but it does appear to be Chinese in origin, whereas I think you can doubt the Indian origin of yoga.
Well, yoga is, as you say, incredibly popular. There are two yoga studios within walking distance of this, where we're talking today. And when I was in San Francisco, everybody was a yoga teacher, or everyone was in training to be a yoga teacher. If not,
That's part of the pyramid scheme with yoga because actually there's so many yoga teachers being churned out that they can't get enough work just teaching people who want to learn yoga. So I mean, I've had it happen to me when I was going to the classes. Someone come and say, "Oh, you're very good. You should become a yoga teacher," and basically that's the way of them getting you to spend more money for them to teach you. Although some of the qualification is quite worrying because I'm not hung up on people having paper qualifications, but they need experience to teach something. And there's a good teacher and there's a bad teacher. And, a lot of people get a yoga qualification. They go somewhere for 2 weeks or slightly more than 2 weeks, and they get a 200-hour yoga qualification. They can get employed in any London local authority gym on that. And really, when you go to their class and you get taught by them, you realize that I've never, I'm not a qualified trainer or anything. I've never trained anyone apart from an entirely amateur-friendly category for friends, maybe help them with a few things. But I could go in a yoga class and think, actually, I know more about safely exercising than the teacher does. Because I take the trouble to read sports science, I try and learn what I can, and I certainly wouldn't offer my services professionally. But sometimes I felt that kind of some of the teachers had even less expertise than I did.
well, I think before we get into Pierre Bernard, we should talk a little bit about the New Thought movement that buttresses some of this or runs through your argument in the book. So could you tell us just kind of briefly what the New Thought was, and then we'll talk about good old Mr. Bernard.
Well, New Thought was a 19th century American kind of invention, which you could liken to positive thinking. And it has various derivations, which other writers have documented better than I have, although it runs through the argument of the book, as you say. And then a key figure at the turn of the 20th century is a guy called William Walker Aikens, who was a guy who wrote dozens and possibly hundreds of books on New Thought under his actual name and under the pseudonym Yogi Ramacharaki. He also wrote books on yoga, which proved quite influential. I mean, people like Ezra Pound were clearly using those books, and Indra Devi, who's mentioned in the book, first came across yoga through a Ramacharaki book as well, and became interested in a teenager because of him. Obviously, his name in the pseudonym sounds Indian, but isn't. And then, that strain of thought goes through people like Norman Vincent Peale, who is, I understand, to have been Donald Trump's preacher and who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, so is allegedly the major theological influence on Trump. So there's an interesting line running through all that material. Um, and, it's all that law of attraction kind of you can make the universe manifest for yourself, and if you think positively, everything will go well for you, which maybe if you've read some Hegel, you might think you need some or Adorno on top. You might want some negative dialectics as well, but we won't. That was the kind of stuff I used to read when I was younger. I don't really read philosophy.
Yeah, me too. So if you were to describe the great Pierre Bernard, in a few sentences, and then we'll get into his influence and what he did. Who was this character?
Well, as far as we know, he appeared pretty much out of nowhere at the end of the 19th century, performing kind of circus tricks, allegedly going into a death trance. There are newspaper reports, but you never know how much you can rely on a newspaper report, and particularly the kind of newspaper report that's going to be about someone going into a death trance and having needles put through their skin. So, he allegedly slowed his breathing and had people perform various kind of unpleasant things on him. Uh, he also seems to have been involved in kind of medicine show type activities, kind of going up and down the West Coast. He has a very sketchy biography. We don't know for sure what his real name is. His biographer, Robert Love, says we do, but the evidence for his real name and date of birth is that a family relative of Bernard saw it in a family Bible, which is not really credible historical evidence. I mean, it could be right, but you can't test it against anything. It's not really an official document. It's a rumor or an allegation. So certainly by 1905, 1906, he was still on the West Coast and running something called the Tantric Order of America, but there didn't appear to be a Tantric Order of Canada, let alone India or anywhere else. And he published one issue of the Journal of the International Tantric Order, which Indiologists, which I'm not, but Indiologists like Hugh Urban describe as a kind of typical mishmash of kind of misinterpreted Tantra and kind of Western occultism, in Bernard's case, with a kind of sex magic aspect, which also feeds into yoga in a fairly big way through Aleister Crowley on the British side of the Atlantic. Um, so he eventually, by certainly 1910, he's in New York. There's a court case against him for trafficking girls, one of whom he allegedly said he could cure her weak heart by having sex with her. Sounds like a familiar story that we've heard more recently with yoga gurus. And he was teaching something that looks like what I would call, after other people like Mark Singleton, who wrote Yoga Body, which is the best known work, kind of placing Western physical training as being adapted by Indians in the 20s and 30s as the origins of modern yoga, modern postural practice. He was married to a dancer, so there's probably some dance influences, and clearly yoga also comes out of this split that you had happening in the 19th century with some thinkers between male and female exercise, where going along with philosophical, or I hesitate to call them philosophical, but kind of ideologies coming from philosophers like Rousseau, of gender differences, that women should be kind of weak, so they wouldn't kind of train to be strong in the way that men do. Although obviously there's plenty of evidence that women can train to be strong and lift very heavy weights, just to take one kind of measure of strength, or do great endurance athletic work. But yeah, it's interesting how dancers always mix in, because when you have dancers demonstrating yoga, it looks very smooth. That was what always impressed me when I saw Richard Hiltman on TV as a child. Not that I paid a lot of attention, it was just on because it was on when I came in from school, one day a week, I think. And I put the TV on, and if it was raining and you couldn't run around the street, then you might try some of the exercises. But you never looked as, although I could always get in the lotus position, which I still can. You never looked as graceful as the dancers he had demonstrating it. But yeah, he's what I would describe him as fundamentally is a con artist or a grifter. I mean, that's what he strikes me as being. So he eventually gets various heiresses who could see him with all his terrible negative publicity as a kind of way of rebelling against their parents and be attracted to him. And he involves various rich kind of Manhattan families in his yoga activities, and then goes on to kind of do other things which he seemed to enjoy more, like running a bank and kind of running sports stadiums and doing whatever. So he's a kind of con artist impresario who comes up through a kind of Houdini trickster medicine show tradition. and who may have been the inventor of modern yoga, but we don't know for certain. But I certainly can't find any evidence of anyone doing that kind of mixture of kind of Orientalist fairy dust dropped onto physical exercise before Bernard.
Well, and he didn't just kind of popularize the exercise, but he also kind of set the stage for future yoga gurus, at least in the Western tradition, through this sexual misconduct, you know, grift, financial grift, theatrical showmanship. This is a thread that kind of runs through everyone you talk about in the book. Did you choose the people in the book because they fit the mold, or did the you just found that they all everyone you looked at fit the mold?
No, I found they all fit the mold. I mean, the way I was trying to work out, and it's quite difficult. I mean, there's a woman called Barbara Newcomb who I quote in the book who wrote, she's American academic, but she's based in the UK, and she wrote a book called Yoga in Britain. And, I realized some of what she was saying was problematic because she tried to identify certain books as the early yoga bestsellers. Um, and when you actually look, there's, Ryder, who in the occult strain of yoga, who were a London-based publisher, their offices were bombed during the Blitz and all their records appeared to be lost. Other publishers she approached said they didn't have the records anymore. So you can't judge on sales, but I was trying to look for kind of who was influential, who published books, but also in terms of Bernard's followers, there's two who got a lot of magazine coverage which we'll move on to, I guess. Francis Yates Brown and Theus Bernard, who is actually Pierre Bernard's nephew, who also adopted the name Bernard. Interestingly, it doesn't appear to be the original family name, but we can't know for sure. Who, kind of faked a lot of activities in Tibet. And again, one of the things you realize that when you're reading about Bernard, a lot of the biography, especially prior to him becoming known, is based on his own testimony, and there's no other source for it. And the fact that he's clearly an unreliable narrator of his own life should make you suspicious of that. But then I mean, I hadn't done the same level of research, kind of just really detailed, trying to go through sources and find out where they came from to do with Indra Devi. But again, she has a biography by Michel Goldberg, and there's material, quite interesting material on her in Elliot Goldberg's The Path of Yoga. But when you compare their biography with the biography she provides in her own books, it looks like their biography just comes from her. So how believable is it? Do we actually believe her father was a Swedish banker who disappeared in Russia working with the whites during the revolution? Well, maybe, maybe not, but I'd like some more evidence. So yeah, they do. I tried to pick them because I was looking for what seemed to be influential in the West, and I wanted to go back to Bernard particularly because I saw two of the disciples. I thought the magazine coverage was really, they appeared to have fairly wide magazine and newspaper coverage. Yoga doesn't appear to be a perfect subject for the radio, but and I didn't dig up any references to yoga on the radio, but it would certainly be worth going and doing more work in that area because those were the two kind of mass mediums. So you're looking for kind of magazines, newspaper, and radio coverage to indicate influence in the lack of actual sales figures for a lot of the books that were published that appear to be lost.
Before we get into the fascist Nazi connection, I'd like to kind of unpack the occult first, because I think in our two countries, there's a different tradition. And when we think of the occult in the Americas, we tend to think of it as the satanic panic. Everything is, there's a white evangelical Christian movement that says you can't do yoga because you're inviting the devil in. But I think in the book, your linking to the occult has more to do with figures like Crowley and Blavatsky or whatever her name was, and
Blavatsky,
yeah,
yeah.
Blavatsky. So could you kind of detail what you mean by the occult and then how it figures into yoga?
Okay, yeah. No, I mean, I'm not talking about satanic panic. You do get Satanists, and particularly Nazi Satanists, are quite popular on the internet these days, unfortunately. Um, but that that particular Christian discourse is curious because I actually got asked at a live event I was doing about the book a few weeks ago about saying, well, Christians don't like yoga. And I'm saying, well, no, that's not true. Certain Christians don't like yoga. But, have you read J.M. Tishane, whose most famous book is Christian Yoga? And there's these other books like Yoga and the Jesus Prayer tradition. There is actually, particularly in the 70s, 60s, 70s, there was quite a strong Christian movement, certainly in Europe, for using yoga for kind of advancing your spiritual Christianity. And that was something I thought about looking in relation to the book, but actually there's so much material, I just didn't have time. So, yeah, I mean, that kind of particular Christian discourse shouldn't be allowed to, very fundamentalist discourse allowed to dominate the debate. And obviously, it's possible to have a kind of religious position that might be pagan or might be something else. Or you might even be a Christian and believe that you can use the occult. I mean, if you go back to alchemy and stuff, I don't think the majority of alchemists were necessarily non-Christian, but they kind of had additional beliefs that they added onto it. Um, so you have a tradition that is outside of a normal Christian faith. I mean, Crowley grew up within the Plymouth Brethren, so a very strict um, Christian upbringing, which he rebelled against. So he used a lot of sex magic and other activities that would not be acceptable to a Christian, but he maybe played a little bit on the kind of satanic aspect of things, but he wasn't a Satanist. He was interested in supernatural forces, which I personally don't believe in, but he did, as far as I can tell. Um, and he came, he learned a lot of his occultism in the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, not to be confused with the Greek political party, who may have been interested in Crowley and other figures related to the original Golden Dawn. But again, you see things like Freemasonry, which again, certainly in the English tradition, the United Grand Lodge of England, insists that members have to believe in a supreme creator and is essentially Christian. And, even Blavatsky was fundamentally Christian, but came up with all these stories about hidden masters in the Himalayas, Mahatmas. Um, and the same thing happened with the Golden Dawn. They claimed that they had these secret masters in the Himalayas, which is part of the attraction to Tibet and India, which allows yoga to become popular. But this wasn't being done in a satanic fashion. But there was a belief that you could invoke all these natural forces, or you could tell the future through tarot. Although tarot isn't, as you'll sometimes see claimed, tradition of divination that goes back thousands of years. It goes back to the Italian Renaissance and was originally just a card game of chance that then got adopted by various occultists. And you also have cartomancy with ordinary decks of cards. So but yeah, you don't have to have a non-Christian position. I certainly think in Western yoga as well, the dominant religious influence is also Christian through New Thought and through other things, just through the cultural background of the people involved in it. Even where people reject Christianity, it's still, if you're brought up in that Christian way, it tends to have an influence. And Crowley, through Alan Bennett, his kind of mentor from the Golden Dawn, got introduced to kind of non-physical yoga. And so from very early on in the 20th century was a kind of perhaps the first person in England kind of who was easily accessible teaching yoga. But you might get involved in some interesting sex magic with him through that as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, Crowley's an interesting figure. And I guess that links us to this Nazi and fascist fascination with India and Aryans. And it seems like when I learned about the connection years ago, but it still seems strange that the Nazis looked to India for some of their Aryan myth. And Maybe you could explain that before we get into how it factors into yoga and how the Nazis used yoga.
Or some Nazis, because the kind of use is sometimes exaggerated, just as the occult themes are. I mean, you can take this if you go to Hamish McLaren, who was a disciple of Bernard, who provides the argument, which is the same as in Nazi racial theory, um, that essentially the caste system in India was used to preserve kind of racial distinctions. And so the argument that McLaren, who was one of Bernard's disciples in his book Eastern Philosophy for Western Minds, his argument is that the yoga was invented by the Aryan invaders of the Indus Valley. So you've got these blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aryans. I mean, Francis Yates Brown also argues this, who are as Caucasian or as white as the author believes himself to be. Um, and who invented yoga 5,000 years ago when they were invading the Indus Valley, or shortly after. And they couldn't trust the people who'd previously lived around the Indus Valley. I mean, this is the kind of dividing line between India and Pakistan nowadays. Um, Among other things, because they were too childlike. He also McLaren uses a lot of racial epithets about them, which I won't repeat. To be in he uses the metaphor of you trust a surgeon with a scalpel, but not a child, which is how he differentiates them. Says the Aryans are so far ahead. And in his case, is actually explicitly anti-Christian, which is something you find in elements of Nazi use of it's not just Hindu, because the Tantra comes from kind of smaller, earlier religions often, and comes from a lot of local traditions which tend to get homogenized in books like The Serpent Power, kind of late 19th century supposed interpretations, but that kind of homogenize a lot of the material. But the claim that you find in Yates Brown as well is that, these were beef-eating Brahmins, as Aaron, as you and I, and in McLaren's case, he says that they provide the religion and moral code that Caucasians should follow, because Christianity is a Semitic religion. Yates Brown isn't as obviously anti-Christian as McLaren, although he does take up the Aryan myth, and you see it carried on in the post the Second World War by writers like Harvey Day, who wrote a lot of hack books on the occult and yoga, very popular in his time. He also can't resist talking about the Aryan inventors of yoga, despite the fact that he's clearly proud to have fought against the Axis powers in the Second World War, served his country, and explicitly anti-racist in places in his books, slagging people off for thinking that whites are superior to everyone else. So, but it kind of makes its mark on yoga, that kind of thinking, and that very much, it ties in with Nazi racial theory. I mean, interesting, McLaren wrote two books. His book on yoga, kind of endorsed by Pierre Bernard, and with an introduction by Francis Yates Brown. And his other book was on, he was a journalist, his other book was on the Berbers, who also in Nazi racial theory are configured as Aryan. Often these being because they found that some top original Nazi leader had a racial lineage that appeared not to be Aryan, and then they would, of course, discover that it was Aryan, which accounts for these strange groups that are considered Aryan within Nazi racial theory. I mean, the whole thing being a nonsense, because Aryan was originally a linguistic and cultural distinction, and it really hasn't. Well, race doesn't work biologically or scientifically. It's a cultural belief. And isn't it's experienced as real because of racism, but it isn't real. I mean, so yeah. But that whole Aryan strand, you also find it in quite a lot of occultism as well. It can be activated in all sorts of areas, and certainly was within a lot of yoga theory.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, and Jacob William Herr, and I mean, I really want to get into the Italians, So I don't know if you want to do them first or you want to go straight into.
No, we'll do the Italians because we'll keep
Okay,
it kind of chronological. I keep
good.
jumping around,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
in the book, I do manage to keep it chronological.
you do. So yeah, let's start with the Italians and what they brought to yoga, and because I mean they really introduced the fascist in the fascist yoga, don't they?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, what you had was after the First World War, a dispute around a port town that I'll call Rijeka, but which the Italians call Fiume. Using one name or the other indicates that you take a certain position on the subject, just as I don't know if your viewers would understand that when I refer to Derry, I'm very much referring to Derry and not referring to it by its imperial name, and it is a place in the north of Ireland, not a place that might be named with a imperial name that I'll choose not to use because I do have a certain Irish heritage despite being born in London and a certain sympathy to those politics, which my choice of words indicates, choice of terms for places. So Rijeka was disputed who should control it, with the Italians wanting to claim it, and Gabriel D'Annunzio, which isn't his original name, an Italian poet who thought he was the most important Italian writer since Dante, but is actually a rather bombastic and not very good prose stylist, prose or poetry stylist. Um, Decided to kind of lead a ragtag army of kind of veterans and ardretti, as they called them, into Rijeka, and had as his right-hand man a guy called Guido Keller, who was also a veteran and a kind of plane ace pilot, allegedly. Um, and D'Annunzio kind of invented all the pageantry of fascism, so the balcony speeches when he took over the town, the Roman salutes, the kind of use of religious iconography around martyrs to the cause, which was all taken up by Mussolini and then Hitler. And Mussolini also gained in popularity for his support for D'Annunzio in Italy. Obviously, if you had to live under this system, it was quite horrendous, but some people try to portray it as a kind of pirate utopia or whatever. People like Peter Lamborn Wilson, Harkin Bay, wrote quite atrociously about it, although he's not the only example. He just comes to mind because I'm talking to an American. And yeah, so Keller, along with a guy called Giovanni Cosimo, they had a group called Yoga, and initially there was a futurist newspaper in Rijeka, which they published a column in, and towards the end of the kind of uh, occupation of the city and attempt to create the first kind of proto-fascist state, November, December 1920. They published 4 issues of a magazine called Yoga, which had a swastika on the front. And Cosimo, in particular, had some pretty horrendous views. So, would be talking in his writing for the magazine about the Italians being held back by the negative races, the French, the English, and particularly the Jews. So yeah, with the swastika and the rest of it, you can see the kind of proto-fascist state that they were kind of enforcing on an oppressed local population with a whole kind of racial discrimination against the Slavs because it was a very mixed town of Italian and Slavs. It's in Croatia now, and Rijeka is its correct Croatian name. So yeah, they were, picking up on yoga. This was, 1920. Talking about yoga, it isn't clear whether they had a postural practice, but certainly they had a quite important feed into kind of the development of fascism.
And then that kind of leads us into the Nazis and how did they use it? And as you said, it wasn't widespread, but it is an interesting kind of addition to, I guess, the Holocaust, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was Himmler in particular who was interested in Indian religion and Hauer, the Indiologist, who kind of advised him on faith. Hauer was very anti-Semitic and viewed Christians as essentially Jewish as well. I mean, the attitude you also find in McLaren's book, The Follower of Bernard. So, Himmler supposedly, watched, taking his cue from the Bhagavad Gita and other religious books, Hindu religious books, kind of forced himself allegedly to watch with dispassion executions at Auschwitz, and wanted the kind of entire SS to carry out the Holocaust in this as their kind of fate and duty, as influenced by Juna in Hindu scripture. But obviously there were different positions within the Nazi Party about what was the best religion for National Socialism. So other people thought Christianity, others thought Norse paganism or whatever else. So you could have a whole range of positions. And as we're talking about the Nazis, we can also pull in a couple of British figures. So Crowley's disciple J.F.C. Fuller, who fell out with him over the fact that he didn't believe Crowley defended himself sufficiently well when he was accused of being unmanly for performing sex magic with men. But basically carried on with Crowley's system and what he learned from Crowley. He also was a top member of the British Union of Fascists, and was also a military theorist who was very interested, an historian, very interested in mechanized warfare. So he essentially came up with the ideas that the Nazis developed and then applied to their Blitzkrieg theories. So he was kind of invited as a guest of honor by Hitler to kind of birthday celebrations and military parades, and was allegedly asked by Hitler, what do you think of your children? To which he replied, I can hardly recognize them now, they've grown so much. But he wrote a book on yoga in the 20s, very much coming out of his study with yoga. It's not the postural stuff, but it's a book that kind of feeds through the Rider Publishing occult tradition to do with yoga, and that was being republished after the war and is referred back to by later yoga figures, including Indra Devi, who we mentioned. And then the other figure we mentioned was Francis Yates Brown, who again was invited he was a journalist and was very famous for writing a book called The Bengal Lancer, or The Lives of the Bengal Lancer in America, which became a film with Gary Cooper and was allegedly one of Hitler's favorite films. So was greeted enthusiastically by Hitler, who told him how much he liked the film of his book. The film having about as much resemblance to the book as the book had to, which was supposedly autobiographical to Yates Brown's life. So, Yates Brown in the book claims to have kind of learned, it's in some ways the first yoga bestseller, perhaps, a really big selling book around the world, widely translated, from the beginning of the 30s. And, he claims to have learned yoga in India, but historians like Amy, who've been through his archives and also been through J.F.C. Fuller's archives, who also claims to have learned yoga in India, and she basically shows that Fuller learned his yoga from Crowley, and Yates Brown learned his yoga from Pierre Bernard in the mid-20s. I mean, that's also evident if you read Yates Brown's book. So his first book, called By the Turks, describes him dressing up as a German governess when he was imprisoned by the Turks in the First World War to escape. And there's no mention of yoga. And in later books, he talks about how yoga saved him when he was imprisoned by the Turks, and he might have died if he hadn't had this knowledge. But all his writing about yoga happens after he stayed in Pierre Bernard's kind of yoga commune in Nyack, New York. So again, kind of a very false history and a kind of proven liar, which is this mold, very much in the mold of his guru, in fact. Um, so yeah, but also kind of these figures are on friendly terms with, the leaders of European fascism, and kind of recognized by them as figures of import.
Yeah, it's amazing how there's just a string of lies that undergird so much of the political movement that led to horrific racial murder. And I guess that'll get us through to the end of the war. And you bring up, use a metaphor of a Trojan horse to kind of introduce was it Hittleman and some of the ones who post-war start introducing, if this story wasn't bad enough with kind of the hucksterism and the racial, um, I don't know what it is, the racism, I guess, and some of the anti-religious stuff that comes through of alternate viewpoints. We get to the post-war and it just continues, but it continues differently, and it starts to kind of deny its past, I guess, but also at the same time incorporating some of the new worst ideas that are out there. So could you talk to us about Hittleman and how we get to a anti-science, anti-vax position very early on, even before,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, there's a kind of series of characters. One who particularly fascinates me is James Lee Richardson, who I didn't realize because I knew his books as Desmond Dunn as yoga books. And then when I started researching him, I was surprised that people like Barker and Newcomb hadn't worked out his real name and then hadn't worked out his connection to the occult. But I was born in Wimbledon in South London, which people know from the tennis. But it's not so. And Lee Richardson, I ended up being fascinated with him because he was from New Malden, which is a little bit further out from London, but not very far, and somewhere I have many happy childhood memories of. But it's a kind of boring London suburban place, so it's quite curious to discover this complete huckster selling a mail order yoga course. So, I mean, very, very successfully. Again, it's it would be great if someone could access business records, but probably they don't exist anymore, showing exactly how many yoga courses he sold. But he had offices around the world in the US. He had US addresses and was advertising these mail order yoga courses all around the world. So, just as Charles Atlas had a very big bodybuilding course from the kind of certainly the start of the 50s, he was selling loads of yoga mail order courses around the world. But at the end of the yoga course, the lower yoga course is an advanced one. You get recommended to do all these Insight Institute courses on the occult, which was another mail order operation he had, and at the same time, he'd been since the in the 30s when it was set up, editor of a kind of popularist occult magazine, Prediction, and he gave that up to kind of in 52, 53 to start his own publishing operations. So he's publishing the US edition of, UK edition of US magazines such as Fate and His Health, as well as magazines he originated. But Fate would be full of these UFO stories and other things, but he was also using these publications to. He had a supplements business called Healthcraft, so he was kind of using that kind of fake news around UFOs and whatever else to sell supplements as well, kind of parallel to Alex Jones. So you have that. And we've mentioned Harvey Day, we've mentioned Indra Davies. So moving on to Hittleman, um, he, I mean, he basically becomes a fundamentalist Hindu, although his background is Jewish. And I didn't realize this when I was a kid seeing his programs, but when I sat down and read through his books, he's basically a creationist, that evolution is a ridiculous idea and a real kind of religious fundamentalist. So, I mean, very much in an American mold, and completely impervious to science. Man had to be created perfect. He couldn't have evolved. It's absurd. And talks about the time over which he dismisses evolution happening as being a mere blink of the eye for the yogi and whatever else. And of course, he had a successful TV show. He's probably the biggest kind of figure for promoting yoga in the world before things became more split up through video and everything else, and then the internet later on. So through the 60s and 70s. But of course, he joined the Universal Life Church, or whatever it's called, and claimed religious exemptions and was lucky enough to die from cancer before the IRS really came after him, leaving his widow, who he'd actually divorced, to take the rap, which is just who he'd put on as a director of the companies just to and then kind of decided everything for her, which was again was a scam. So it's this typical in the mold of Bernard and all the other figures, you know, the yoga guru, scammer, con artist, grifter. But yeah, I mean, obviously, with that kind of level of anti-scientific thought, you're just laying the ground for all the anti-vax and other material. And then the other side of that, the figure who finish off with, who was the one who kind of really made me want to write the book and get into the occult side of things, was Frank Rudolph Young, a man who modestly claimed that he expected to live to be 330 years old or more, but went senile and died at 91, as far as we can tell. I mean, Harvey Day actually claimed that death wasn't natural and that the real yogi adept could live forever, but he died 89 or something. So yeah, not quite making it to the lifespans they might have been selling to their readers. But I mean, Young was a total huckster selling mail order courses, advertising in Popular Mechanics and comics and whatever else. The same as the method as a Charles Atlas or the kind of Count Dante Dim Mac Death Touch, if people are familiar with that. All stuff that I looked at in a mesmerized way as a child when I got American comics. Uh, we didn't have quite the same in UK publications. We did have the Buddha you could rub for money, which came from Thames Ditton again in southwest London. So I was always excited by that one, although I didn't believe it would work. So I didn't send off my money for one. But I've seen American ads for that one as well. But yeah. Frank Rudolph Young was kind of, teaching pickup artistry, how to control the other sex with mail order courses. I mean, he was using all sorts of names, different names. Um, and then, teaching bodybuilding, big muscles, all this kind of stuff, and a lot about diet and health in his books. And he did some books on yoga for Parker as well as his kind of more straightforward occult books and claims and possibly was a chiropractor at some point. So he's very obsessed with spinal health as well. But again, chiropractors and osteopaths are not actually scientifically proven to do a lot, but they do have an obsession with the spine, which he reflects and actually gives good advice on a lot of yoga backbending, which is potentially dangerous to the spinal discs and can cause long-term injuries. So, just as a stuck clock is right every 12 hours or 24, depending on what kind of clock you have, he was occasionally right on a subject such as spinal health and yoga backbends not being advisable, which is something you'll find in ballet and all sorts of other exercise systems, but within sports science, they are generally treated as contraindicative or not a good idea. So yeah, but the kind of level of occult insanity that runs through Rudolph Young, he just takes it to an extreme. And then Hiddleman is obviously the kind of the faith-based rejection of science, both of which can contribute to a kind of very negative attitude towards things that are going to do public health a whole lot of good, which is, mass vaccination, clean water. These are the kind of basic life extending kind of tropes that would do better in society. I mean, obviously, we're lucky to have clean water, but not everyone in the world does. And it's a real shame we haven't got mass vaccination to the level needed, 95%, precisely due to the kind of anti-vaccine discourse that's run through yoga and a lot of other things.
Yeah, I watched a video of Hiddleman, and it was amazing to me that he couldn't do most of the things he was having his dancer model kind of do. He would tell her what to do, but he couldn't himself do things. I
No,
thought
it's
was
great. That's why dancers are fantastic because they can't do it because they've trained in yoga. They can do it because they've trained in dance, which is a lot harder.
exactly. So kind of to wrap things up, and I think you've answered this pretty well already, but do you see yoga as offering any benefit given this fraught history? Because it seems like it just continues to have an influence of anti-intellectualism, like spiritual, occultist respectability to kind of ideas that can be very detrimental to people's wealth, health, livelihood, family relations. Um, so, what do you think the state of wellness communities is, and is there hope for some way out of this morass of history?
There's always got to be hope, but we got to push push against the morass and push it down into the dustbin of history. In terms of yoga, I would avoid it because I think a lot of what is taught is potentially dangerous in terms of backbending, full neck rolls. But I'm not saying yoga is the only exercise or sport that entails those. And I wouldn't stop someone, for example, becoming a contortionist because I actually happen to love watching contortion, but I don't think it's good for the person's health. And I think they should go into it knowing what the potential downsides are long term. In terms of people exercising, if they do yoga, they will have some health benefits because any exercise is going to give you health benefits and you get the most at the bottom level of an exercise. But I would suggest that there are other exercises that are perhaps going to do them more good. If you want to go to Tai Chi, there's a lot of woo-woo around Tai Chi, but the thing is, among older people, a problem is falls, which can lead to kind of injury and death quite frequently. And with Tai Chi kind of emphasizing work on the legs and weight shifting between legs, that looks more useful to me once you divorce the woo-woo from it, which some people do and some don't. Weightlifting is a great exercise. You need to build up your leg strength and muscle and bone strength. So squatting and deadlifting are really good things to do, especially for older people. Um, doing some cardio is good. I mean, yoga seems to me to be quite a weak exercise, but I think it would be wrong to say that it has no health benefits whatsoever, but it can also potentially injure you quite badly. The effects on mental health if you start taking on board these kind of things. I mean, I have a Swedish friend whose sister, through yoga, then got into kind of anti-vaccine, QAnon, and everything else. And, she's just completely distraught by it. And you see it, not everyone goes into yoga and goes through it to that level, but it's potentially there. It can potentially have some very negative impact. So I think it's just, arguing against this thing that yoga is good. I mean, when I was at going to the yoga classes at the local gym, I used to complain to the management about the content of the classes and say, no, this is an exercise class. I only want exercise. I don't want to be told about chakras which don't exist, or, any other wellness nonsense. I don't want to be told that standing on my head will cure my cold. Because there are better ways to cure a cold, or perhaps just live through it. But yeah, it's that pushback, but yoga has kind of advanced itself so far, and obviously you've got your own government health problems going on in the States, which fortunately we don't have here yet. But given the way Trump's had the red carpet over here, one does worry about American influence.
Well, yeah, and I'm hoping that the evidentiary experience of our experiment here will will downplay the influence globally, but it's very worrisome where we're at, and
Yeah.
it just seems like so much of it comes out of this wellness space.
I think the thing with the wellness space is because it particularly enables the ideology to spread among women, and they wouldn't be reached by the kind of the rest of the ideology, the QAnon and the other stuff, without that kind of wellness space to do it within. I mean, there are some men do yoga, but if you go to yoga classes, you will find that they're overwhelmingly female. I mean, it depends on the yoga. If you go to Ashtanga, you'll find more men because it's more athletic, but it also has higher injury risk. I must say it was the style I preferred, but probably reflecting my cisgender status.
Well, thank you for your time. And are you working on anything new that we can look forward to?
There's a couple of there's a novel that was written some time ago that I will revise at some point because I will go back to novels. And there's a little book which should be coming out with PM Press, which we're in their Outspoken Authors series. we're kind of arguing about the contract, just little details, as one does with a publisher. And, I'm kind of figuring out exactly where I want to go in terms of a non-fiction book next. So, one area of interest is the relationship between sport and BDSM, which is quite evident in things such as wrestling. And of course, I have a love for things that using Bourdieu, you could describe as on the edge of the field of sport. A fascination with wrestling, bodybuilding, yoga, which kind of don't meet all the requirements of normal sports. I mean, obviously, Olympic wrestling does, it is competitive, but I'm not a huge fan of WWE, but I love the old British fake wrestling of the 70s. So figures like Mick McManus and John Haystacks were an important part of my childhood, which will mean nothing to Americans. They can look them up though
Yes, exactly.
online.
Well,
So yeah, I mean maybe that, and also just the influence of religion on sport. So muscular Christianity to go back to the 19th century. And obviously conspiracy theories, but some, given the times, you think maybe I should be writing on contemporary political issues. It's quite pressing and quite depressing at the moment. But I think we can fight back and win.
I think so too. So it's
You got to believe it.
yeah.
It's going
Otherwise,
to happen. We'll win in the end. There's a world to win, and we'll win it.
that's right. Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.